Sarah Martinez had always been different. Growing up in a small Texas town where everyone knew everyone, she stood out not for what she said, but for what she didn't say. At 12 years old, a car accident had damaged her vocal cords so severely that speaking became nearly impossible. The doctors said she might never speak normally again. For most people, this would have been devastating. For Sarah, it became her greatest strength. The accident happened on a rainy November evening. Sarah's family was driving home from her younger brother's soccer game when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact sent their car spinning into a concrete barrier. While her parents and brother walked away with minor injuries, Sarah bore the brunt of the crash. A piece of twisted metal had caught her throat, and by the time the paramedics arrived, she was barely conscious and choking on her own blood. The months that followed were filled with surgeries, speech therapy, and countless medical appointments. Her voice, once bright and cheerful, was reduced to barely audible whispers and raspy sounds. Kids at school started calling her names. Mute girl, they would snicker. Silent Sarah. Teachers often forgot she was there because she never raised her hand or spoke up in class. But Sarah's silence taught her something powerful that her classmates never learned. She learned to watch. She learned to listen. She learned to read people's faces, their body language, their smallest movements. While other kids chattered away, missing important details around them, Sarah absorbed everything like a sponge. She noticed when someone was lying by the way they avoided eye contact. She could tell when trouble was brewing by watching how people shifted their weight or clenched their fists. Her father, Miguel Martinez, was a retired Army sergeant who had served 3 tours overseas. He saw what others missed in his daughter. While the world saw a disabled girl, he saw a warrior in training. Instead of pitying her, he began teaching her things that would serve her well. Hand signals became their secret language. She learned to move silently through the house, a game they played where she tried to sneak up on him. She rarely succeeded, but each attempt made her better. Miguel also taught her to fight, not with anger or aggression, but with precision and purpose. He showed her pressure points, leverage techniques, and how to use an opponent's strength against them. Size and volume don't matter, he would tell her in sign language. Intelligence and preparation do. By high school, Sarah had transformed from a victim of circumstance into something extraordinary. She joined the wrestling team, shocking everyone when the quiet girl consistently pinned opponents twice her size. She learned multiple martial arts, studying each discipline with the focus of someone who couldn't afford to waste time with idle chatter. Her coaches were amazed at how quickly she learned, not realizing that her inability to speak had forced her to develop other skills far beyond normal levels. College brought new challenges and opportunities. Sarah studied criminal justice and psychology, fascinated by human behavior and law enforcement. Her professors were initially concerned about how she would participate in discussions or present findings. Those concerns vanished quickly when they realized that Sarah's written work was exceptional and her observational skills were unlike anything they had seen. She could analyze crime scene photos and spot details that seasoned detectives missed. She could read interrogation videos and identify deception with startling accuracy. During her junior year, a military recruiter visited campus. Most students walked past the booth without interest, but Sarah stopped. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant James Wilson, was initially hesitant when she approached. How could someone who couldn't speak serve in the military? But something about her presence intrigued him. She moved with purpose, her eyes constantly scanning the environment, taking in details. When she handed him a note explaining her interest, he was surprised by her directness and intelligence. "I want to serve my country," the note read. "My disability is not a limitation. It's an advantage that your enemies will never see coming." Wilson had seen many recruits over the years, but none quite like Sarah. He spent the next hour communicating with her through writing and basic sign language he knew from a deaf brother. The more they talked, the more impressed he became. Here was someone who had turned a perceived weakness into incredible strength. He told her about special operations, about units that valued unique skills and unconventional thinking. The path to the Navy SEALs was not easy for anyone, but for Sarah, it required jumping through additional hoops. Military doctors had to evaluate whether her condition would interfere with duties. Psychologists assessed whether she could handle the stress without normal verbal communication outlets. Training officers worried about team cohesion and communication in high-stress situations. Sarah passed every test they threw at her. Physical fitness assessments that broke hardened athletes, she completed with determination that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. Psychological evaluations revealed a mind that was not only stable but exceptionally focused and resilient. The communication concerns were addressed when she demonstrated her fluency in military hand signals and her ability to understand complex tactical instructions through visual cues alone. The day she received orders to report to Naval Special Warfare Training, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and nervous excitement. She had spent years preparing for this moment, but she knew the real challenge was just beginning. Her family gathered for what might be their last dinner together for many months. Miguel looked at his daughter with unmistakable pride. The scared 12-year-old girl who had been silenced by tragedy had grown into a confident young woman ready to serve at the highest levels of the military. Her mother, Elena, worried constantly but tried not to show it. She had watched Sarah overcome obstacle after obstacle, each time emerging stronger than before. Still, the thought of her daughter in combat situations made her heart ache with fear. But she also knew that trying to stop Sarah would be futile. This was her calling, as clear as anything could be. Sarah's younger brother, Carlos, had grown up in awe of his big sister. While other kids saw her as different or disabled, he saw her as superhuman. She could sneak into his room and surprise him no matter how carefully he listened for her approach. She could tell when he was lying about homework or chores just by looking at his face. Now she was going to become one of the most elite soldiers in the world, and he couldn't have been prouder. The night before she left, Sarah sat alone in her childhood bedroom, looking at photos from over the years. Pictures from the hospital after the accident, showing a scared young girl with bandages around her throat. Photos from high school wrestling matches where she stood victorious over much larger opponents. College graduation pictures where she stood with academic honors despite never speaking a word in class. She thought about all the people who had underestimated her over the years. Teachers who assumed she wasn't smart because she didn't participate verbally. Classmates who thought she was weak because she was quiet. Even well-meaning relatives who suggested she pursue realistic career goals that would accommodate her disability. None of them understood that what they saw as a limitation had actually been preparing her for something extraordinary. As she packed her bags, Sarah felt no fear about what lay ahead. The years of silence had taught her patience. The years of being underestimated had taught her the power of surprise. The years of watching and listening had taught her to see what others missed. She was ready to show the world that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who never says a word. The bus ride to training camp was long and quiet. Other recruits chatted nervously about what they expected, sharing stories of their backgrounds and reasons for joining. Sarah listened to all of it, filing away information about each person's strengths, weaknesses, fears, and motivations. By the time they arrived at the base, she already knew more about her fellow recruits than they knew about each other. The first day of training would be a rude awakening for everyone involved. Instructors were infamous for their brutal honesty and willingness to break down anyone who thought they were tough enough for special operations. Most recruits would be eliminated within the first few weeks, sent back to regular military service or civilian life with their dreams crushed. But Sarah had been preparing for this her entire life, even when she didn't know it. Every moment of silence had made her more observant. Every challenge she had overcome had made her stronger. Every person who had underestimated her had motivated her to prove them wrong. She was about to enter a world where being underestimated wasn't an insult, it was a tactical advantage. The other recruits had no idea what was coming. They would soon learn that the quiet woman among them was not someone to be pitied or ignored. She was someone to be feared, respected, and hopefully called a teammate. The girl who had been mocked as mute was about to show everyone exactly how dangerous silence could be when wielded by someone who had mastered it completely. Training was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez was ready for war. The Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado, California was a place where dreams went to die. Officially known as Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, or BUD/S, it had broken thousands of hopeful recruits over the decades. The statistics were brutal. Only about 20% of those who started would actually earn their SEAL Trident. The rest would ring the brass bell that stood in the center of the compound, signaling their surrender and the end of their special operations dreams. Sarah Martinez arrived with Class 347, a group of 180 men and one woman who thought they had what it took to become America's most elite warriors. The moment she stepped off the bus, she could feel the stares. Not just because she was the only woman, but because word had already spread about the recruit who couldn't speak. Whispers followed her everywhere. How's she supposed to call for backup if she can't yell? One recruit muttered to another. Probably won't make it past the first week, came the response. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson was the lead instructor for Class 347. A 20-year Navy veteran with multiple combat deployments, he had seen every type of recruit imaginable. Cocky athletes who crumbled under pressure. Quiet intellectuals who surprised everyone with their toughness. Rich kids trying to prove themselves. Poor kids trying to escape their circumstances. But he had never trained someone like Sarah Martinez. Thompson had read her file extensively before her arrival. The medical reports, psychological evaluations, and academic records painted a picture of someone truly unique. Still, reading about someone and seeing them perform under pressure were two entirely different things. He was curious to see how she would handle the intense physical and mental challenges ahead. The first week was designed to shock new recruits into the reality of SEAL training. Physical training sessions that lasted for hours. Obstacle courses that seemed impossible. Swimming tests that pushed people to their absolute limits. And, through it all, constant verbal harassment from instructors whose job was to find each recruit's breaking point. For most recruits, the verbal attacks were almost as challenging as the physical demands. Instructors would scream inches from their faces, questioning their commitment, their intelligence, their worthiness to be there. They would find each person's sensitive spots and attack them relentlessly. Family problems, academic failures, relationship issues. Nothing was off limits if it might reveal weakness. But, with Sarah, the instructors faced an unusual challenge. How do you break someone mentally when traditional verbal tactics don't apply? Thompson and his team had to develop new approaches specifically for her. Instead of screaming at her, they would use hand gestures and written messages to deliver the same brutal psychological pressure they applied to other recruits. You think being disabled makes you special? Thompson wrote on a whiteboard during one particularly intense training session. Out there, the enemy won't care about your sob story. They'll just put a bullet in your head while you're trying to explain yourself with hand signals. The other recruits watched these exchanges with a mixture of curiosity and relief. They were grateful not to be the target of Thompson's attention, but they also wondered how Sarah would respond to such harsh treatment. Many expected her to break down in tears or storm off in anger. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledged the message, and continued with whatever exercise they were performing. What the instructors and other recruits didn't realize was that Sarah had been dealing with much worse than anything they could throw at her for most of her life. School bullies had called her every name imaginable. Doctors had told her she would never be normal. Society had written her off as disabled and limited. Compared to a lifetime of that treatment, having military instructors question her abilities was almost refreshing in its honesty. The first major elimination event came during the third week, the infamous drown-proofing exercise. Recruits had their hands and feet bound, then were thrown into a swimming pool where they had to survive for 20 minutes without drowning. They had to perform specific tasks like retrieving objects from the bottom of the pool using only their teeth, all while fighting panic and the natural instinct to breathe. Many recruits who had excelled in other areas completely fell apart during drown-proofing. The combination of physical restraint, water, and time pressure created a unique form of terror that revealed who could truly handle extreme stress. Sarah watched as several of her classmates panicked in the water, thrashing helplessly until instructors pulled them out. Each failure was followed by the sound of the brass bell ringing as another dream ended. When Sarah's turn came, the pool area fell unusually quiet. Even the instructors seemed curious about how she would perform. Being unable to call for help if something went wrong added an extra layer of danger to an already risky exercise. Thompson positioned himself closer to the pool than usual, ready to intervene if necessary. Sarah entered the water with the same calm focus she brought to everything else. While other recruits had fought against their restraints, she seemed to work with them, using small movements and precise positioning to stay afloat. Her breathing was controlled and measured in the moments before her head went underwater. When it came time to retrieve objects from the pool bottom, she moved with an efficiency that impressed even the most skeptical observers. What nobody else could see was the mental game Sarah was playing. Instead of fighting panic, she embraced the silence that surrounded her in the water. This was her element, a place where everyone else was as voiceless as she was. The muffled sounds and visual-only communication felt natural to her. While other recruits struggled with sensory deprivation, Sarah found it comforting and familiar. She completed every required task ahead of schedule and with less apparent effort than any recruit Thompson had ever seen. When she finally emerged from the pool, There was a moment of stunned silence before the instructors moved on to the next person. Several recruits who had been dismissive of her abilities began looking at her with new respect. But if Sarah thought she had proven herself, she was mistaken. The instructors, led by Thompson, decided that her success in drown-proofing meant she needed to be tested even more rigorously. They began singling her out for additional challenges, extra physical training, and closer scrutiny of every action she took. During one particularly brutal beach run, Thompson ran alongside Sarah and communicated through hastily written notes while they moved. "You think you're special because you passed one test?" the note read. "Wait until you're in a firefight, and your team needs you to call in air support. How are you going to do that with hand signals?" Sarah's response came not through words or notes, but through action. She increased her pace, leaving Thompson and several other recruits behind as she powered through the sand. Her message was clear. She would answer challenges with performance, not explanations. The other recruits began to take notice of these exchanges. Some started to resent what they saw as unfair targeting of Sarah by the instructors. Others wondered if her apparent advantages in certain areas meant she was getting special treatment. A few began to see her as a threat to their own chances of success. Jason Kowalski, a former college football player from Michigan, became particularly vocal about his concerns. He had initially felt protective of Sarah, thinking she was in over her head and would need help from stronger recruits like himself. When it became clear that she was outperforming him in several areas, his attitude shifted to resentment and suspicion. "This whole thing is rigged," he complained to other recruits during one of their rare rest periods. "She gets to skip half the verbal stuff because she can't talk, and now they're going easy on her physical tests too." Mike Chun, a former Marine who had joined the Navy specifically to become a SEAL, disagreed strongly. "Are you kidding me? Did you see her in the water today? She made that look easier than a warm bath. And the instructors aren't going easy on her. If anything, they're being harder on her than on us." The debate about Sarah's place in the training program began to divide the remaining recruits. Some saw her as an inspiration, proof that determination could overcome any obstacle. Others viewed her as a liability who would endanger the team in real combat situations. A few simply resented the attention she received, positive or negative, when they felt their own struggles were being ignored. Thompson was well aware of these dynamics developing within the group. Creating tension and conflict between recruits was actually part of the training process. Real SEAL teams had to function under extreme stress while dealing with personality conflicts, leadership disputes, and life-or-death disagreements. Learning to work together despite personal issues was just as important as physical conditioning or weapons training. But Sarah was creating challenges Thompson had never dealt with before. Her presence was affecting group dynamics in ways that were both positive and negative. Some recruits were inspired to push themselves harder, not wanting to be shown up by someone they had initially underestimated. Others were becoming distracted by debates about fairness and special treatment. The situation came to a head during the 6th week of training, when the class faced their most difficult challenge yet, Hell Week. 7 days of virtually continuous physical and mental challenges with less than 4 hours of sleep total. It was designed to push recruits beyond their absolute limits and eliminate anyone who lacked the mental toughness to be a SEAL. Hell Week started on a Sunday evening with hours of physical training in the surf. Recruits were soaked, cold, and exhausted before the real challenges even began. They would spend the next week carrying heavy boats over their heads, running endless miles in wet uniforms, and performing complex tactical exercises while fighting off hallucinations from sleep deprivation. Many recruits who had survived everything up to this point would finally break during Hell Week. The combination of physical exhaustion, mental stress, and emotional pressure created a perfect storm that revealed each person's true character. Some would quit in the middle of the night. Others would make it almost to the end before finally ringing the bell. For Sarah, Hell Week represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned about herself over the years. All the challenges she had overcome, all the doubts she had faced, all the preparation she had done, it all led to this moment. The girl who had been mocked for her silence was about to face the loudest, most chaotic week of her life. The instructors had special plans for her during Hell Week. They wanted to see what would happen when someone who relied on observation and careful planning was thrown into complete chaos. They were about to learn that underestimating Sarah Martinez was a mistake that even seasoned special operations veterans could make. Monday morning of Hell Week arrived like a nightmare given form. The 73 recruits who remained from the original 180 stood shivering on the beach at 0400 hours, already exhausted from a night of surf torture and calisthenics. Their uniforms were soaked with ice-cold Pacific Ocean water, their bodies aching from hours of punishment, and their minds already beginning to fracture under the relentless pressure. Senior Chief Thompson stood before the group with his trademark cruel smile. Behind him, other instructors prepared equipment for the next phase of torment. Boats that would need to be carried for miles. Logs that weighed more than most of the recruits. Medical personnel who would be very busy over the next 6 days. "Welcome to Hell Week, ladies," Thompson announced, his voice carrying easily over the sound of crashing waves. "This is where we separate the real warriors from the wannabes. Over the next week, you'll get about 4 hours of sleep total if you're lucky. You'll be wet, cold, hungry, and miserable every minute of every day. Most of you will quit. Some of you should quit right now and save everyone time." Sarah stood in formation with the others, her eyes constantly moving to assess the situation. While many of her fellow recruits were already showing signs of distress, shaking from cold, glazed expressions from exhaustion, nervous fidgeting, she appeared surprisingly calm. Years of dealing with challenges that others couldn't understand had taught her to conserve energy for when it really mattered. The first major test came within hours, the boat races. Each 7-person team had to carry a heavy rubber boat over their heads and race other teams across the beach, through the surf, and around a series of markers offshore. It was pure physical torture disguised as a competition, designed to push every recruit to their absolute limits while fostering either teamwork or resentment. Sarah was assigned to Boat Crew 5, led by Jason Kowalski, the former football player who had become increasingly critical of her presence in the training program. His team included Mike Chun, the ex-Marine who had defended Sarah earlier, along with 4 other recruits who were still forming opinions about their unusual teammate. "Listen up," Kowalski announced to his crew before the race began. "We're going to win this thing, but only if everyone pulls their weight. No special treatment, no excuses. If you can't keep up, speak up now." He looked directly at Sarah when he said this, making his meaning clear. Sarah simply nodded and took her position under the boat. When the whistle blew, Crew 5 lifted their rubber boat and began running toward the surf. Within minutes, it became clear that Sarah was not the weak link Kowalski had expected. Despite being smaller than most of her teammates, she maintained her position and pace without apparent difficulty. The real test came when they reached the water. Carrying a heavy boat through crashing surf while trying to maintain formation was a nightmare scenario that had broken many previous classes. Teams that lost coordination would find themselves tumbled by waves, fighting for their lives while instructors watched without helping. As they entered the surf, chaos erupted around them. Other boat crews were struggling with the powerful waves, some losing control entirely. Shouted commands were lost in the noise of wind and water. Visual coordination became nearly impossible as salt water stung eyes and foam blocked vision. But Sarah had an advantage that nobody else possessed. She had spent her entire life communicating without words, reading subtle cues that others missed entirely. While her teammates were trying to shout instructions over the noise, she was watching their body language, anticipating their movements, and adjusting her own position accordingly. Mike Chun was the first to notice what was happening. "She's reading us," he shouted to Kowalski over the sound of crashing waves. "Look at her position. She knows where we're going before we do." Indeed, Sarah seemed to be predicting the team's movements with uncanny accuracy. When someone was about to stumble, she was already shifting to compensate. When the boat needed to be repositioned to avoid a wave, she was moving before anyone gave the command. Her silent presence was actually helping the team coordinate better than many crews who could communicate verbally. Boat Crew 5 finished the race in second place, their best performance yet. As they collapsed on the beach afterward, several team members looked at Sarah with new appreciation. Even Kowalski seemed grudgingly impressed, though he tried not to show it. "Not bad," he admitted between gasps for air. But this was just the warm-up. He was right. The boat race was only the beginning of a week that would test every aspect of their physical and mental endurance. Over the next several days, the recruits would face challenges that seemed designed by someone with a deep understanding of human breaking points. Sleep deprivation began to take its toll by Tuesday evening. Recruits started making simple mistakes that could have been dangerous in real combat situations. They misunderstood instructions, forgot basic procedures, and began snapping at each other over trivial issues. Hallucinations started appearing by Wednesday, with exhausted minds creating threats and obstacles that weren't really there. But While her classmates struggled with the psychological effects of extreme fatigue, Sarah seemed unusually resilient. Her years of dealing with communication challenges had taught her to stay focused and observant even under stress. While others were becoming confused and disoriented, she remained alert and aware of her surroundings. This became crucial during one of the most dangerous exercises of Hell Week, the night navigation course. Teams had to move through a series of checkpoints in complete darkness while carrying heavy equipment and avoiding enemy instructors who would eliminate anyone they caught. It was designed to simulate operating behind enemy lines, where a single mistake could mean death or capture. Boat Crew 5 found themselves lost within the first hour. Their compass readings didn't match the terrain, and the landmarks they were supposed to use for navigation were invisible in the darkness. Other team members were becoming frustrated and argumentative, with some wanting to backtrack, while others insisted they should push forward. Sarah had been observing the situation carefully, noting details that her teammates had missed. She tapped Mike Chun on the shoulder and pointed in a specific direction, then held up 3 fingers and pointed again. Chun understood immediately. She had spotted a checkpoint marker that the rest of them had walked past. "She's right," Chun whispered to the others. "There's a reflector tape about 50 meters that way." The team followed Sarah's guidance and found the checkpoint exactly where she had indicated. More importantly, she had noticed the patrol pattern of the instructor enemies and guided the team around them without being detected. Her ability to observe and process visual information in conditions where others were nearly blind proved invaluable. As the week progressed, Sarah's unique skills became increasingly apparent to both her teammates and the instructors. During a complex beach assault exercise, she spotted defensive positions that other teams missed entirely. In a prisoner rescue scenario, she identified the real hostages among decoys by reading their body language and facial expressions. During equipment inspections, she caught safety issues that could have caused serious injuries. The instructors began to take notice of her consistent performance. Thompson had expected her to break under the pressure of constant chaos and confusion. Instead, she seemed to thrive in conditions where normal communication was impossible and visual observation was crucial. "She's different," Instructor Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez observed to Thompson during a brief break between exercises. "Most recruits get tunnel vision when they're this exhausted. She's still seeing everything." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. He was beginning to understand that his assumptions about Sarah's limitations had been completely wrong. Her inability to speak wasn't a disability in this environment. It was giving her capabilities that none of the other recruits possessed. But not everyone was impressed by Sarah's performance. As the week continued and more recruits dropped out from exhaustion and stress, some of those who remained began to resent her apparent advantages. A few started suggesting that she was receiving special treatment or that the exercises were being modified to favor her unique skills. The tension came to a head during Friday's log PT session, one of the most grueling exercises in all of SEAL training. Teams had to carry telephone pole-sized logs over their heads for hours while performing various calisthenics. It was pure physical torture designed to break down individual egos and forge team unity through shared suffering. Boat Crew 5 was down to 6 members after losing 1 recruit to a medical issue earlier in the week. They were struggling with their log, which seemed to get heavier with each passing hour. Sarah was carrying her full share of the weight, but several teammates were beginning to falter. "This is insane," gasped recruit Danny Williams, a former Army Ranger who had seemed indestructible earlier in training. "I can't feel my arms anymore." Kowalski was pushing the team harder than ever, determined not to be the crew that failed in front of the instructors. "Suck it up," he growled through gritted teeth. "We're not quitting now." But it was becoming clear that they were in trouble. 2 team members were showing signs of heat exhaustion, and another was developing dangerous muscle cramps. The instructors were watching closely, ready to remove anyone who became a safety risk. That's when Sarah did something that surprised everyone. Instead of maintaining her position under the log, she began moving around to different positions, taking extra weight from teammates who were struggling. She couldn't speak to coordinate with them, but she used touch and eye contact to communicate what she was doing. Within minutes, she had redistributed the load so that the strongest members were carrying more weight, and the exhausted ones could recover slightly. It was a subtle adjustment that the instructors might not have noticed, but it probably saved several teammates from medical dropout. Mike Chen understood immediately what Sarah had done. "She just saved our asses," he panted to Kowalski. "Look around. Williams isn't shaking anymore, and Rodriguez got his color back. Even Kowalski had to admit that Sarah's actions had kept the team together when they were close to falling apart. For the first time since training began, he looked at her not as a liability or special case, but as a genuine teammate who had proven herself under pressure. The final challenge of Hell Week was the most complex, a multi-phase exercise that combined everything they had learned into one massive test of skill, endurance, and teamwork. Teams would have to navigate through enemy territory, capture specific objectives, rescue hostages, and extract safely while being hunted by instructors playing opposing forces. As Boat Crew 5 prepared for the final exercise, the dynamic had shifted completely from where it started. Sarah was no longer seen as someone who needed protection or special consideration. She had become one of the most valued members of the team, someone whose unique abilities made everyone else more effective. But the exercise would present challenges that none of them had faced before. Real bullets would be flying overhead during some phases. Live explosives would be detonating around them. Smoke, noise, and chaos would create conditions that closely simulated actual combat. It was the ultimate test of whether these recruits could function as elite warriors when everything went wrong at once. Sarah had proven herself capable of handling the physical and mental challenges of SEAL training. Now she would have to show that someone who communicated through silence could lead others through the loudest, most violent exercise in the entire program. The girl who had been mocked for not speaking was about to demonstrate that actions truly did speak louder than words. Saturday evening marked the beginning of the culminating exercise of Hell Week, known simply as the Gauntlet. Of the original 180 recruits who had started BUD/S training, only 47 remained. They were exhausted, battered, and running on nothing but determination and pride. But they were also stronger than they had ever imagined possible. The exercise was designed to simulate a real special operations mission from start to finish. Each remaining boat crew would have to infiltrate enemy territory, neutralize specific targets, rescue hostages, and extract safely while being pursued by instructors playing opposing forces. Live ammunition would be fired over their heads. Real explosives would detonate around them. Smoke, tear gas, and simulated chemical weapons would create a hellish environment that closely replicated actual combat conditions. Sarah stood with the 5 remaining members of Boat Crew 5 as Senior Chief Thompson briefed them on their specific mission. The dynamic within the team had changed dramatically over the course of Hell Week. Jason Kowalski was still the official team leader, but everyone now looked to Sarah for tactical insights and situational awareness that had repeatedly saved them from failure. "Your target is a weapons cache located in Building Alpha," Thompson announced, pointing to a detailed map of the training facility. "Intelligence reports indicate the location is heavily defended with automated weapons systems and patrol units. You'll also need to locate and extract a high-value prisoner being held somewhere in the complex." The briefing continued with details about enemy positions, communication protocols, and extraction procedures. But Sarah was only half listening to the verbal instructions. Her attention was focused on the map itself, studying the terrain features, building layouts, and tactical considerations that would affect their mission. Years of processing visual information had taught her to see patterns and opportunities that others missed. While her teammates were trying to memorize the spoken briefing, she was already developing a mental picture of how the mission would unfold. Potential approach routes, defensive positions, escape routes, and contingency plans were forming in her mind. Mike Chen noticed her intense concentration on the map and positioned himself to see what had caught her attention. "What are you thinking?" he whispered. Sarah pointed to several locations on the map, using hand signals they had developed during training to communicate her observations. She indicated blind spots in the defensive positions, a potential weakness in the patrol routes, and an alternative extraction point that might be less heavily defended than the primary one. Chen nodded his understanding and quietly shared Sarah's insights with the rest of the team. Even Kowalski, who had been resistant to taking advice from her early in training, now listened carefully to what she had noticed. Her track record of spotting important details had earned his respect through repeated success. "Okay," Kowalski announced to the team as the briefing concluded. "We stick to the basic plan, but we use Martinez's observations to modify our approach. Chun, you and Williams take point. Rodriguez and Jackson, you're on weapons and demo. Martinez and I will handle navigation and prisoner extraction." The team moved out into the night, immediately entering a world of controlled chaos. Explosive charges were detonating in the distance, creating constant noise and confusion. Searchlights swept back and forth across the training area, forcing the teams to move carefully between illuminated zones. The smell of smoke and chemical simulants filled the air, making breathing difficult and visibility poor. Within minutes, they could hear other teams engaging with opposing forces. Blank ammunition created realistic gunfire sounds, while instructors shouted commands and simulated radio chatter. Several teams had already been eliminated from the exercise, their members forced to sit out the remainder as casualties. Sarah moved at the point of their formation, using hand signals to guide the team around patrol routes and defensive positions she had memorized from the briefing map. Her ability to navigate silently and spot threats before they became dangerous was proving invaluable in the chaotic environment. They reached the perimeter of the target building without being detected, a significant accomplishment given the density of simulated enemy forces in the area. Other teams they could hear were already engaged in firefights, some successful and others clearly struggling. Boat Crew 5 had managed to maintain the element of surprise. The weapons cache was located in a fortified building with multiple defensive positions around the perimeter. Automated training devices would fire on anyone who approached without proper tactics. Live instructors playing enemy soldiers would pursue and eliminate anyone they spotted. And somewhere in the building was a hostage who needed to be located and extracted without being killed in the process. Sarah studied the building carefully, looking for details that the briefing hadn't covered. Security cameras, motion sensors, defensive positions that weren't marked on their map. She spotted several things that could affect their approach and quickly communicated them to the team through their established hand signal system. She's right, Chen whispered after observing the building through binoculars. There's a camera covering the main entrance that wasn't in the briefing, and those defensive positions have overlapping fields of fire. Kowalski made a quick decision based on Sarah's observations. Instead of the frontal assault that their original plan called for, they would use a more complex approach that avoided the strongest defensive positions. It would take longer and require more precise coordination, but it gave them a much better chance of success. The team split into two elements, with Sarah leading half of them around to an alternate approach route she had identified. Moving through smoke and darkness while avoiding detection required exactly the kinds of skills she had been developing her entire life. Silent movement, precise timing, and constant awareness of her surroundings. They reached their assault position without being detected, a minor miracle given the intensity of the exercise. Sarah positioned her team members to provide covering fire while she and Chen moved toward the building entrance. The plan called for them to neutralize the defensive positions quickly and quietly, then locate the weapons cache and prisoner before enemy reinforcements arrived. But as they began their assault, things went wrong immediately. The automated defense system detected their movements sooner than expected, triggering alarms throughout the facility. Simulated gunfire erupted from multiple positions, forcing the team to take cover behind whatever obstacles they could find. Even worse, other teams' activities had attracted additional enemy forces to their area. What should have been a precise surgical operation was turning into a chaotic firefight with multiple opposing elements. Several team members were already wounded by the training ammunition, reducing their effectiveness significantly. In the middle of this chaos, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of staying in a defensive position, she broke cover and began moving toward the building entrance alone. Her teammates watched in shock as she disappeared into the smoke and confusion, apparently abandoning the coordinated team approach they had planned. But Sarah wasn't abandoning anything. She was using her greatest advantage, the fact that enemies expected to hear approaching threats. In an environment filled with shouting, gunfire, and explosions, someone who moved silently was nearly invisible. While everyone else was making noise and drawing attention, she slipped through the defensive positions like a ghost. She reached the building entrance while the automated systems were focused on her teammates' positions. The hostage was supposed to be located somewhere inside, but the building was dark and filled with obstacles. Finding one person in that environment while avoiding detection would be extremely difficult for most people. For Sarah, it was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for her entire life. She moved through the building methodically, using her enhanced observational skills to spot signs of recent occupancy. A disturbed dust pattern here, a warm spot on a wall there, subtle indicators that most people would never notice. She found the simulated prisoner, actually an instructor playing the role, in less than 5 minutes. He was bound and gagged in a back room, supposedly guarded by enemy forces that Sarah had somehow avoided entirely. When she appeared beside him and began working on his restraints, he looked genuinely surprised. "How the hell did you get in here without anyone seeing you?" he whispered as she freed him from the training setup. Sarah just smiled and pointed toward the exit. There wasn't time for explanations, and besides, actions were always more convincing than words anyway. Getting out of the building with the prisoner should have been even more difficult than getting in. Enemy forces were now actively searching for infiltrators, and the automated defense systems were operating at full alert. But Sarah had observed something during her entry that gave her an idea. Instead of trying to fight their way out through the main defensive positions, she led the prisoner through a route that took advantage of the chaos other teams were creating. While enemy forces were focused on the major firefights happening around the perimeter, she slipped out through a less defended area that had been temporarily abandoned. When she emerged from the smoke with the rescued hostage, her teammates were stunned. They had been preparing for a major assault to rescue her, assuming she had been captured or eliminated when she disappeared into the building. Instead, she had single-handedly accomplished the most difficult part of their mission. "Outstanding work, Martinez," the instructor playing the hostage told her as they reached the designated extraction point. "I've been playing that role for 3 years, and nobody has ever extracted me that quickly or quietly." But the exercise wasn't over yet. They still needed to locate and secure the weapons cache, then extract safely while being pursued by enemy forces. And now that their position had been compromised by the successful prisoner rescue, they would face much heavier opposition. The weapons cache was located in the building's basement, protected by several layers of defensive systems. Standard procedure would be to fight their way through each layer systematically, accepting casualties in exchange for forward progress. But Sarah had a different idea. During her prisoner rescue, she had observed the building's layout and defensive systems more carefully than anyone else could have in the time available. She knew exactly where the strongest defenses were positioned, but she had also spotted their weaknesses. Systems designed to stop frontal assaults weren't necessarily effective against unconventional approaches. She communicated her observations to the team through their hand signal system, outlining a plan that would bypass most of the defensive positions entirely. It was risky and required precise timing, but it offered their best chance of completing the mission without losing team members to simulated casualties. Kowalski listened to her plan and made a quick decision. "We do it her way," he announced to the team. "She's been right about everything else tonight." The assault on the weapons cache was unlike anything the instructors had seen in years of running the exercise. Instead of the expected frontal attack, Boat Crew 5 seemed to appear from nowhere, neutralizing defensive positions they shouldn't have been able to reach, and securing their objective before enemy forces could respond effectively. Sarah had turned a chaotic firefight into a precision operation by using her unique ability to see opportunities that others missed. What should have been the most difficult part of the exercise had become almost routine under her tactical guidance. But as they prepared to extract with their objectives secured, the real test was just beginning. Enemy forces from across the training area were converging on their position, determined to prevent their escape. The final phase of the exercise would pit their small team against overwhelming odds in a running gun battle that would test everything they had learned about teamwork, tactics, and determination. Sarah had proven that someone who communicated through silence could lead others through complex operations. Now she would have to show that her unconventional methods could work under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The girl who had been underestimated her entire life was about to demonstrate exactly how dangerous that mistake could be. The extraction phase began with Boat Crew 5 trapped in a building surrounded by an overwhelming enemy force. Through the windows, they could see instructors positioning themselves at every possible exit route. Searchlights illuminated the area around the building, eliminating most cover and concealment options. Radio chatter indicated that additional opposing forces were moving into the area to ensure no one escaped. This was the scenario that had broken many previous classes. After completing the most difficult parts of their mission, teams would find themselves cornered and systematically eliminated during what should have been a routine extraction. The psychological impact of failing so close to success had caused many recruits to quit even after surviving Hell Week. Jason Kowalski looked around at his remaining team members. Danny Williams was nursing a simulated shoulder wound from earlier in the exercise. Rodriguez was running low on ammunition after the prolonged firefight at the weapons cache. Chen looked exhausted, but determined. And Sarah Martinez stood calmly near a window, studying the enemy positions with the same focused intensity she brought to everything else. Options. Kowalski asked the team quietly. We could try to fight our way out, Rodriguez suggested. Put down covering fire, and hope we can reach the extraction point before they pin us down. That's suicide, Chen responded. There are at least 20 instructors out there, and they know exactly where we're going. Williams pointed to a back exit they hadn't used yet. What about that way? Maybe they haven't covered it as heavily. Kowalski was about to respond when he noticed that Sarah was trying to get his attention. She was pointing out the window at something specific, using hand signals to indicate what she had observed. He moved to her position and looked where she was pointing. At first, he didn't see what had caught her attention. The area around the building appeared to be completely covered by enemy positions, just as they had assumed. But, as he watched more carefully, following Sarah's gestured directions, he began to see what she had spotted. The instructor positions were designed to cover all the obvious escape routes, but they had a critical flaw. The searchlight patterns created moving shadows that could provide concealment for someone who understood their timing. More importantly, the enemy forces were positioned to watch for groups of people moving together, not individuals moving separately. Sarah was proposing something that went against every principle of team tactics they had been taught. Instead of staying together and fighting their way out as a unit, she wanted them to split up and extract individually using different routes and timing. It was risky and unconventional, but it might be their only chance of success. Are you crazy? Williams whispered when Kowalski explained Sarah's plan to the team. We're supposed to stick together. That's basic tactics. Basic tactics got the other teams eliminated, Chen pointed out. She's been right about everything else tonight. Kowalski studied the enemy positions again, this time looking for the patterns and opportunities that Sarah had identified. Slowly, he began to see what she meant. The defensive setup was designed to stop conventional approaches, but it had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone willing to take calculated risks. We do it her way, he decided. But if anyone gets compromised, abort immediately and try to link up at the secondary extraction point. The plan required precise timing and coordination. Each team member would exit the building at specific intervals, using different routes that Sarah had identified through her observation of the enemy patrol patterns. She had calculated the searchlight timing, guard rotations, and communication lapses that would create brief windows of opportunity. Rodriguez went first, slipping out through a basement window during a gap in the searchlight coverage. The team held their breath as they watched him move across open ground, staying in shadows and timing his movement to avoid detection. He reached the tree line without being spotted, the first successful extraction of the exercise. Williams followed 5 minutes later through a different route, using a drainage system that Sarah had noticed during their initial approach. His movement was more difficult due to his simulated injury, but he managed to reach safety by following her precise instructions about timing and positioning. Chen's extraction was more complex, requiring him to move through an area that was more heavily patrolled. But Sarah had observed that the guards followed predictable patterns, and she had identified a brief window when their attention would be focused elsewhere. He made it through by timing his movement perfectly with their rotation schedule. That left Kowalski and Sarah alone in the building, with the most difficult extractions still ahead. The enemy forces were becoming more alert as time passed, and some of the instructors were beginning to suspect that people were escaping despite their thorough coverage of the area. You go next, Kowalski told Sarah. I'll follow after you're clear. But Sarah shook her head and pointed to herself, then to him, then to the exit route she had chosen for their escape. She was indicating that they should go together, using a path that required coordination between two people. Kowalski was about to argue when he realized what she had spotted. There was a route that could work for two people moving together, but only if one person could move completely silently while the other provided distraction at precisely the right moment. It was an incredibly risky plan that required perfect timing and absolute trust between team members. You want me to create a distraction while you slip past their perimeter? He asked. Sarah nodded, then gestured to indicate the reverse. She would create the distraction while he escaped first. She was volunteering for the most dangerous part of the extraction, the role that was most likely to result in capture or elimination. For a moment, Kowalski hesitated. Everything in his military training told him that the team leader should take the greatest risks and protect his subordinates. But his recent experience with Sarah had taught him that conventional thinking didn't always apply to unconventional situations. Okay, he agreed. But if this goes wrong, I'm coming back for you. Sarah just smiled and moved toward her chosen position. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even when she didn't know it. Every challenge she had overcome, every time she had been underestimated, every moment of silence that had taught her to see what others missed, it all led to this. The extraction began with Sarah moving to a position where she could observe the entire enemy defensive setup. She waited until the searchlights and patrol patterns aligned exactly as she had calculated, then signaled for Kowalski to begin his movement. At the critical moment, she created a distraction that was perfectly calibrated to draw attention without revealing her position. A thrown object that made noise in exactly the right location at exactly the right time. The enemy forces reacted predictably, shifting their focus and creating the opening that Kowalski needed. He moved through the gap in their coverage like a shadow, reaching the extraction point without being detected. The plan had worked perfectly, but now Sarah was alone in a building surrounded by increasingly alert enemy forces who were beginning to realize that their supposedly perfect defensive setup had been systematically defeated. This was the moment that would define everything. All the years of being called mute and disabled had led to this test of whether someone who communicated through silence could outthink and outmaneuver an entire squad of experienced special operations instructors. Sarah moved through the building one final time, studying the enemy positions and looking for the pattern that would allow her own escape. The instructors had adapted their positions after realizing that people were escaping, making her task much more difficult than her teammates had faced. But she had one advantage that none of them possessed. She had been watching and learning from their reactions throughout the entire exercise. She understood how they thought, how they communicated, and how they coordinated their activities. While they were trying to adapt to her unconventional tactics, she was already several steps ahead of their thinking. Her final escape route was something that no instructor would have expected because it violated every principle of tactical movement they had ever learned. Instead of trying to sneak past their perimeter, she was going to walk right through it using their own communication patterns and coordination methods against them. She had observed that the instructors were using radio communication to coordinate their positions and share information about potential escape routes. By timing her movement to coincide with their radio traffic and using her knowledge of their patrol patterns, she could move through their positions during the brief moments when their attention was focused on their communications rather than visual observation. It was an incredibly risky plan that required split-second timing and absolute confidence in her observations. If she was wrong about any detail of their coordination, she would be caught in the open with no chance of escape. But if she was right, she could accomplish something that no recruit had ever done before. Sarah began her movement at the precise moment when she calculated that the enemy forces would be most distracted by their internal coordination requirements. She moved not like someone trying to avoid detection, but like someone who belonged there and had every right to be moving through their positions. The psychological effect was exactly what she had calculated. Human beings were programmed to notice things that didn't fit expected patterns, but they often overlooked things that seemed normal and routine. By moving with confidence and timing her approach to coincide with routine activities, she became nearly invisible to observers who were expecting to see someone trying to sneak past them. She walked through the entire enemy perimeter without being challenged once, reaching the extraction point where her amazed teammates were waiting. The instructors didn't realize what had happened until several minutes later, when they began checking positions and discovered that all 6 members of Boat Crew 5 had somehow escaped from what should have been an impossible situation. Senior Chief Thompson arrived at the extraction point just as Sarah was completing her final tactical debrief with the team. He had been monitoring the exercise from a central command position, watching as team after team was systematically eliminated by the carefully designed defensive scenarios. But Boat Crew 5 had not only survived every challenge, they had completed their mission objectives faster and more efficiently than any team in the history of the exercise. More remarkably, they had done it while being led by someone who couldn't speak and had been dismissed by many as unsuitable for special operations. Outstanding work, people, Thompson announced to the team. You just accomplished something that most special operations veterans would consider impossible. He looked directly at Sarah as he continued. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I spent the first half of this training trying to find your breaking point, assuming that your communication limitation would eventually get you killed or get your teammates killed. I was wrong. The other instructors were gathering around to hear the debrief, many of them shaking their heads in amazement at what they had witnessed. Rodriguez, the instructor who had played the hostage role, was particularly vocal in his praise. I've never seen anything like it, he told Thompson. She moved through our positions like we weren't even there. It wasn't luck or accident. She had obviously studied our patterns and found weaknesses we didn't even know existed. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. What you people accomplish tonight will be studied and taught for years to come. You've proven that unconventional thinking and adaptive tactics can overcome overwhelming odds. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Sarah's own teammates. Jason Kowalski, who had started the training program convinced that she would be a liability, stepped forward to address her directly. I was wrong about you from day one, he admitted. I thought your disability would make you weak, would make our team weaker. Instead, you made us better than we ever could have been without you. You didn't just prove yourself tonight. You proved that everything we thought we knew about strength and leadership was incomplete. Mike Chen nodded his agreement. You never said a word, but you led us through every challenge we faced. That's real leadership. As the team prepared to return to base for their final evaluation, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared 12-year-old girl who had lost her voice in a car accident had become a warrior who could lead others through the most challenging situations imaginable. She thought about all the people who had underestimated her over the years, who had seen her silence as weakness rather than strength. They would never understand that being forced to communicate without words had given her abilities that no amount of traditional training could provide. The instructors began announcing the final results of Hell Week. Of the 180 recruits who had started the program, only 31 would continue to the next phase of SEAL training. Boat Crew 5 had not only survived, they had excelled in ways that would be remembered and studied for decades. But, for Sarah, the real victory wasn't in the statistics or the praise from instructors. It was in the knowledge that she had finally found the place where her unique abilities were not just accepted but valued. She had proven that there was no such thing as a disability, only different ways of being strong. As they walked back to the barracks, Danny Williams looked at Sarah with genuine admiration. So what's next for the Silent Warrior? Sarah smiled and pointed toward the base flagpole, where the SEAL Trident insignia flew alongside the American flag. Her message was clear without any words being spoken. She had found her calling, and she was just getting started. The girl who had been mocked as mute had taken down an entire squad of experienced instructors using nothing but intelligence, observation, and the power of silence. She had proven that the most dangerous person in any situation might be the one who never says a word. The legend of Sarah Martinez was just beginning.